from Abuja.
It's all about the human struggle to raise the level of living. That's what it's all about. I'm Magnus Paco, and this is Magnus Paco GVA. I'm glad you're part of this. Microcredit. Can you really end poverty with it? Yes, but not without microcredit, a key driver for high-quality economic growth in poor countries. I've been saying this for many years. In poor developing countries, no one can end poverty without access to credit and human capital development. You simply can't do it. Our poor people need access to capital. They need tools to work with. There are ways and strategies for succeeding against poverty. But in Africa, it is clear from the results out there that we have not been serious enough. In general, we are not using the strategies that work. When you are in government and as a government official, sometimes it is difficult to effectively share ideas or even get the resources or tools needed to do a job. Instead, quite often, you get all kinds of false accusations thrown at you. Some people even pay to publish these things everywhere, knowing them to be false. Now, let's get to the point. There is a sharp difference between poverty eradication and poverty reduction, not in grammar, but in substance. Poverty eradication may never happen or be sustained without poverty reduction, which is about strong and sustained high-quality economic growth. Consider that you have high water in your room. To completely remove it, you need a mop. But can you mop high water? If you're going to be successful, the first thing you would need to do is to reduce the water level by hooking the room to a motorized pump and a hose. And when the water is reduced to floor level, the pump may no longer be that effective. Remember that mop? You would need it now. The point is, for poverty eradication to be successful, you need a pump and a hose. You've got to get the water level down. That means you need high-quality growth to reduce the unemployment and poverty levels. Then you may start mopping. You cannot succeed using microcredit for poverty eradication in any community unless there is sustained high-quality economic growth. The given our situation would involve microcredit. My key point, you cannot mop high water, and economic growth by itself also will not do the trick. The trickle-down expected from economic growth will almost never work in the presence of significant poverty. To be successful, you need top-down and bottom-up approaches. Access to credit for poor people is essential in Africa, where wage employment is scarce. No economic development program will be successful without it. But it is not for the government to get involved directly in implementing credit. It will have to be done by financial intermediaries. The government's role should be catalytic, with monitoring and a bit of coordination. Now, high-quality economic growth. There are new innovations to help Africa achieve high-quality growth and be more effective in fighting poverty. There is one critical innovation that I just want to mention right now: positive contagion. In a few weeks, we will discuss positive contagion and how it is important in fighting poverty. Positive contagion. We will be right back. In our hidden economics for you, how about the economics of why couples should fight often? Couples fight is good for your marriage. Husbands and wives and other approved couples are in an economic partnership, and they don't know it. They are in an economic transaction. If your partner offends you, it imposes a cost on you. It is a cost because you must find a way to reduce the pain of the offense, whether it is large or small. The cost may be in time, in effort, in money, or it may be psychic. That is, it may be psychological. The offending partner will have to stop committing the offense or make a payment to offset the cost of it. And the payment has to be adequate. If an appropriate payment is not made, the costs and resultant debts will accumulate and lead to market and transactions failure between the couple. If you don't reveal and discuss the offense, your partner may never be able to assess the cost, and therefore an appropriate payment may never be made. Again, if you keep the offenses to yourself, please never let them out later. The cost by that time may be too much for your partner to pay, and market failure may occur. Caution: don't bring up frivolous offenses. Such offenses are often not well prized by a partner. That's what nagging is. Nagging represents a cost to your partner, and you must stop it or make a payment for it. Bottom line, fight is good for your relationship. In our first episode of the Unrighteous Economy, we introduced the concept of free radicals. Free radicals are disproportionately represented among those in the working age population who are not actually working or looking for work. People who are reasonably educated and have lost their jobs can be very harmful free radicals, as they are able to mobilize many others to hurt society. Professor Charles Dokuba of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs in Lagos has a strong view that security is about development, as we will see in our discussion with him.
Security has been termed mainly to be a sort of regime security. That's the security of the regime in power. They have not seen security as a sort of in the context of human security, which is the new concept. The argument is this: if the individual is secure, then the state will be secure. And that most have argued that the individual should be the reference point of security instead of the state itself. Because towards the end of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st century, most states have even killed more of their citizens than any other threat that they've suffered from. Certainly, when a nation and when the rulers of a state have taken care of the various facets of development that affects the individuals and citizenry of that state, then definitely that state will be secure.
As we continue our discussion with Professor Dumas, we will see how security is important for economic development to be sustained. As Professor Dumas has said in his book, The Peacekeeping Economy, which I think anyone serious about national security in Africa should get, nations are set up by people to provide that which they cannot provide for themselves as individuals. National security is primary among these things. But national security is not just about the armed forces. That certainly are very important, but it is also about income security. A household hardly feels any sense of security if they have no food to eat, or if they face grim prospects for their jobs and overall economic opportunity. Although there is great progress being made across Africa, an unrighteous economy in many countries is preventing people from effectively participating in the economic development process to guarantee national security. As we have mentioned, Professor Dumas has published many books and numerous articles in 11 languages. He has discussed his work on TV and radio programs all over the world. He's an authority in economic development. Let's take a look at another portion of my discussion with him at his home and on the campus of the very prestigious and beautiful University of Texas at Dallas. When we're talking about aid and trade, we're looking to see how we can use it to speed economic growth and development. But in a situation where you have security concerns, African countries, here they are trying to speed growth and development, but they also, it appears, have to be very aware of security concerns. And in some cases, are putting out large chunks of their budget for security issues. how can they, with the meager resources that they have already, be able to grow their economies if they have to pay so much attention to security? You know, we've had cases of terrorism in Kenya and Nigeria involving even the United Nations. And my question then is, can they continue, can they be as successful as they would have been if they have to pay so much attention to security issues?
I think the key, first of all, security is very important. We all understand that. But the key to it is understanding that security and military strength and military spending are not the same thing. In fact, security has always been mainly a matter of relationships, not of military threats or military force, the use of military force. Sometimes, in fact, when we use military threats and military force to achieve security, we just make the situation worse. The U.S. operations in Iraq, for instance, we went into Iraq partly because we were worried that there were terrorists who might be in Iraq who would get their hands on nuclear weapons and cause all sorts of trouble. But in fact, there were no al-Qaeda operatives in Iraq at the time, and there are now, because of many years of military force being used, many civilians being killed, accidentally, I'm willing to assume. But nevertheless, the effect of that violence on the public was to create exactly the opposite effect and reduce security. And you can see, for example, the importance of relationships in security by looking, for instance, at the U.S. during the Cold War. The United States spent trillions of dollars and a great deal of time and effort trying to figure out how to protect the country from the hostile Soviet Union. But they didn't spend 10 minutes or $10 thinking about how to protect the United States from a nuclear attack from France or Britain, which had the capability to do devastating damage to the U.S. Why not? Of course, why not? It's obvious why not, because France and Britain were friendly countries. When you have good relationships with people, you don't have to protect yourself against them. So I think the most important thing to begin with is a shift of way of thinking about security, to understand that economic interactions, if they're done right, can actually create more security at much lower cost, and therefore not take resources at the same time away from economic needs like education and infrastructure building and so on. For example, in the issue of trade, there's been a long-term debate as to whether trading between countries provokes war or prevents war. But it seems to me the answer lies in what kind of trade relationships there are. If there are relationships that are one way, in which the flow of benefit is overwhelmingly in one direction, these are exploitative relationships, they do create hostility and problems of various sorts and insecurities. No one needs to tell the African nations about exploitation. They've been exploited for many years during colonial period, and they're still being exploited. The other kind of trade relationship is balanced, mutually beneficial relationships. These are relationships in which both sides gain not necessarily exactly the same, but pretty much the same benefit, and both sides have the same decision power in making decisions about the relationships. Those kinds of trade relationships tend to bind countries together and prevent war and prevent hostility. In fact, we have a good practical, I can give you two good practical examples of how this works. One is the European Union. It was established originally in 1952 as the European Coal and Steel Community. There were 6 countries only involved at the time. And the purpose of establishing that group was to bring them together economically so they'd stop fighting with each other militarily, which they had done for centuries. In fact, if you look at the 1980s, the membership of the predecessor of the European Union at the time included countries like Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Britain. These countries had fought countless wars with each other over the generations, over the centuries, and they were the main colonial powers that exploited the rest of the world, including Africa. And yet today, if you would go on the streets of any of those countries, stop anybody you choose to stop, and ask them what they think the odds of their country going to war with any other European Union country are, they would look at you like you came from a different planet. They wouldn't understand the question. Nobody thinks like that anymore. That's a tremendous shift from thinking in military terms of security to thinking in economic terms of binding countries together in mutual benefit. And I can give you another example for the United States. The United States and Canada have such a cordial relationship and have had such a cordial relationship for so long that people in the U.S. sometimes even forget Canada is a separate country, which doesn't please the Canadians too much, but it's a wonderful relationship, the longest disarmed border in the world. But in fact, in the American Revolution, the Canadians were the bad guys. They were the guys who sided with the British and fought against the colonists. And in fact, there was tremendous hostility against Canada in the early period of the United States. In the middle of the 19th century, there was a naval arms race on the Great Lakes. It looked like war would break out between the U.S. and Canada. But slowly over time, we built up these balanced, mutually beneficial economic relationships with Canada, and that totally changed the situation. I think there's a lesson there for Africa and for the rest of the world. If we establish the right kinds of balanced, mutually beneficial relationships between African countries and the outside world, and within African countries themselves, we can create security without having to spend so much on economically unproductive military activity.
Absolutely, I really like that point when I read this book, The Peacekeeping Economy. But what I didn't quite see, and as you discussed this, Professor Dumas, I want you to try to see if you could link it to a situation where the issue is more internal. That is, say where you have ethnic groups that don't quite agree. I don't know whether the same principle applies, as would be between one country and another. When you have this is when the security threats are from within the country. And perhaps it's not even between ethnic groups, but when there are pockets of disgruntled elements that could cut across ethnic groups and provincial areas, but become a threat. Would this same principle of economic relationships and looking to have mutually beneficial outcomes, would that still work as would work amongst countries?
It certainly would work, because when we think about it, we talk about trade between countries, but it's not really countries that trade with each other, it's businesses that trade with each other, it's individuals that trade. And in fact, it's not the United States trading with France, it's American companies trading with French companies and trading with the French public and so on. When you think about it that way, it's not just nation to nation, it can be people to people within countries. If people involved in relationships, in business relationships within a country, have balanced, mutually beneficial relationships with each other, relationships that are more collaborative, more partnership kind of relationships, relationships in which they both gain, they won't want to mess it up. And when they have problems with each other, which they certainly will, because we're humans and we are very conflictual, we have problems with each other from time to time, they'll have a strong positive incentive not to ruin the relationship, but to manage the conflict so it doesn't ruin the relationship. And that's a very important difference. It certainly can be done within countries. It also requires building of a more diversified economy. Economies which are focused on one commodity like oil, as is so important in the Nigerian economy, don't have the diversity of economic activity that allows this principle to be used as easily within the countries as it could otherwise be. But these principles certainly do apply within countries as well. And as you know, one of the principles, besides balanced, economically mutually beneficial relationships, is emphasizing development.
Yes.
And that certainly applies within countries as well. In every country in the world, there are some areas that are not as developed as others, even in the richer countries. Certainly that's true in Africa. And spreading that economic opportunity out over a wider part of the population tends to dull this hostility and get rid of these stereotypes. And there's another thing involved too. When people do business with each other, they deal with each other as people. At first they may be very suspicious of each other, but eventually they get to know each other a little bit. And these stereotypes we have, these ridiculous stereotypes we have of people of other ethnic groups, tend to fade away. The common humanity comes out. They won't always love each other, but these stereotypes, these destructive stereotypes, will likely disappear. And that will be very important to keeping the peace within countries as well as between them.
It is clear. The thing that has held Africa back is, simply put, lack of economic participation. Africa has not done enough to motivate its people, to invest in its people for them to be optimally involved in the economic development process. Africa has essentially allowed poverty to tear patches of destruction all across the land. Today in Africa, there are many countries where the unemployment rate is approaching 50%. The average poverty rate across Africa is also around 50%. All this constitutes grave deprivation. All this poverty and deprivation, when will it end? Are we a part of the global community to represent a pitiful people and dramatize a shameful condition? In the global competition out there, I believe that Africa can do better. Indeed, in the midst of it all, there are signs of rapid progress, as we can see in the economic buoyancy of countries like Botswana and Ghana. And as we can also see in Rwanda, where without great amounts of mineral resources, the poverty rate is declining rapidly. Even so, many African countries are not very successful in raising the level of living for the people because they are in an unrighteous economy where human endeavor is significantly and persistently repressed, leaving the people with little hope and opportunity. If we get down to it, it is not foreign aid that would do it for us. It is not our governments that would do it. The fate of Africa is in the hands of the ordinary African. Africa is blessed by God with an incredible variety of natural resources. Our leaders will have to be chief motivators and encouragers. But it is the people of Africa that must individually and collectively free themselves from the prison of poverty. But there will never be any hope of this happening unless everyone has access to constructive participation in the economic development process. Don't wait for the government. Talking about motivation, our leaders have to be great motivators. They have to make us understand that we have to get involved. What we need from the government is a supportive environment and access. But we need personal commitment from the people. It is in our own interest to be successful. In 2010, I was watching an African Cup of Nations semi-final game between Ghana and Nigeria. As the game had just a few minutes to go, I saw a teaching moment happening from the sidelines from Coach Shuaibu of Nigeria. He stood up, pacing the sidelines and shouting to the captain of the team, "Motivate them, motivate them." Nigeria wound up losing the game by a lone goal scored early in the first half. But the Nigerian players were, at the time of the coach's encouragement, really putting Ghana under great pressure. Coach Shuaibu, you are a good coach, and you can coach my team anytime. The strength and energy of Africa must be engaged. That's what economic participation is all about. When the energy is not well harnessed, it can be destructive. People who are left out are usually not happy. They can become free radicals and cause great disharmony and even destruction. To overcome an unrighteous economy, we must keep our kids in school, raise the girl-child enrollment rate, provide access to literacy and life skills training for our uneducated population. No one should be left out. We have to find ways to make sure that everyone has a clear and visible access way to the economic development process. All the problems of unemployment, poverty, and insecurity are traceable to repression in economic participation. If we can get the private sector to be robust so that there are big, medium, small, and micro companies, and if economic freedom is assured in the presence of a supportive environment of adequate security and infrastructure, and we invest in the people of Africa to be competitive in the global marketplace, if we have adequate economic participation, we will eliminate throughout Africa any unrighteous economy. I'm Magnus Packle, and that's my view.